All right. My name is Brian Scannell. I'll be talking about the Perl Navigator language server and Raku Navigator as well. I'm excited to be here. Thanks to the Perl Foundation and everyone for coming out. It's my first Perl conference as an attendee, and I figured if I'm going to be here, might as well talk about something. So it goes. Famous bank robber Willie Sutton once was asked, why did he rob banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. And pretty straightforward. It's, go to where whatever it is you're looking for, head directly to it. And there's sort of a follow-up question of the Perl community and the Raku community are looking for new developers and looking to provide support to existing developers. So there's a question of where are those developers? Some of them are here in this room, but most of them are at their desk, heads down, in an editor. So these are results of the Stack Overflow 2022 developer survey. These results just came out yesterday, and Stack Overflow asked 70,000 developers what editor they use primarily, or what editors they use. 74% of professional developers are using Visual Studio Code, and 81% of developers that are learning to code are in VS Code. So it's really the overwhelming majority of people are using VS Code, and even more so the younger generation that is learning to program. So we're trying to target people for Perl and Raku to help them come into the community, help them learn. That target really needs to be Visual Studio Code. The other takeaway from this chart is that it's not only VS Code, but there's this long tail of other editors. So any solution that you build for editor extensions really needs to apply to all the other editors as well. So it's Visual Studio Code first and support for this long tail of editors. And that's really what this presentation is about and what language servers try to achieve. So if anyone wants to follow along, you can install the Perl Navigator or the Raku version from the marketplace. And just search for Perl Navigator or Raku. Install. It should come with all dependencies, sort of batteries included. You don't need to go to the command line and install anything else. This, of course, assumes that you have VS Code. If you have another editor, Vim, NeoVim, Emacs, Sublime Text, you can go to my GitHub page and install that. And I'll give more details around what a language server is. So first, there's a question of what's an IDE. An IDE, what I think of is, it does two main things. You have text editing capabilities, like syntax highlighting and file system interaction, window management, and it also provides code intelligence, autocompletion, go-to definition. And an IDE takes those two things that I think of as fairly distinct and puts them together in a single package, often tailored for a specific language. And other people may use what they call an editor, not an IDE, or an editor and extension model like Vim or Emacs. That's a core text editor, and then you add extensions on top of it that are still tailored toward that editor. Vim Perl, FlyCheck, Syntactic, lots of editor-specific extensions that target one specific editor. And that's, of course, very helpful for people's workflow, but is only targeting one editor. And therefore, you don't get the benefits of those extensions across other editors. So what a language server is, or the language server protocol, it's a standardized protocol for connecting editors and language servers that provide code intelligence. So it's a language server is an independent process that will provide autocompletion, diagnostics, perhaps refactoring support. And by connecting it with a standardized interface, you can connect it up to Visual Studio Code, Vim, Emacs, And then all the work that goes into building these code intelligence features can be shared across the whole community. So you can reduce that duplication of effort. And anyone who makes an improvement because they work in Emacs and they find some part of their workflow lacking, that the rest of the Perl community can benefit from those changes. And that's where the language server protocol as a standard is very important. So what it looks like when you pull it all together, this is a screenshot of Visual Studio Code and an example of a simple Moose class where it has a couple attributes, it has a single method, and it has an error in there. And what the code intelligence features provide, as you see on the left, there's an outline, there's some code parsing that is saying there's a package here called point, there's the attributes, there's a subroutine, there's diagnostics, there's autocomplete, and they'll show up sort of right in the editor. And this is all, again, baked in, sort of all dependencies included. So those are the core features, at least: symbol provider, diagnostics, autocompletion. And the way that it is able to work without requiring external dependencies is by reusing the VS Code Node.js runtime. So VS Code is an Electron app that provides a Node.js backend. So the Perl Navigator is written really in two parts. Half of it is written in TypeScript to leverage this Node.js backend and the Microsoft language server libraries that handles the asynchronous processing, the event loop, responds to events, and is able to keep this process alive while calling out to Perl for the Perl to do the core processing. So by splitting it, it's able to let the TypeScript part focus on really what it's good at. It's asynchronous processing and reusing existing language server libraries, and let the Perl part focus on what it's good at, is parsing Perl and producing diagnostics. So we'll get into how diagnostics work. Right? This is sort of Perl 101, right? Is if you have a script, or a module, it's very common to run Perl-C on that file. Perl compile is going to produce your errors and warnings. And this example is just a very short script where I have $foo equals 2, and without the my statement, it's going to be an error because of the usage of useStrict. Run Perl-C on that, and the Perl compiler is great. It tells you exactly what the errors are. It tells you what the error is and where the error is. And then the language server essentially takes that result and serves it back up to VS Code or Vim, and is able to highlight exactly where your error is. And that's pretty standard. I think most editors have syntax checking. I think the more interesting part about running Perl-C is that when you use a module, it actually runs that module. So in this example, I'm using this point module, and point.pm is fully loaded when you run Perl-C. So if you're going to run Perl-C anyway to do syntax checking, and you've now used Perl to parse all of your modules and dependencies, you can get Perl to dump out all of the information that it knows about those modules. And that's the symbol table. So here's a simple example where I've defined this package called check, and all it does is has a small check block. Check blocks will run during compilation time at the end of the Perl compilation phase, but still during a Perl-C check. And in this case, I'm giving an example of inspecting the symbol table at the end of the compilation process. So in this case, I had my point function, and here I'm checking point : clear, which is a subroutine in the point package, pulling that code ref out, passing it to the B compiler backend, calling this svref to object. And this provides metadata that you can inspect. And in this case, when you run, the symbol table knows exactly where this function was defined. So it knows the file name and the line number. And it spits out, I'm running this Perl-C check, but because I include this module, it'll inspect the symbol table and it'll say, oh, point.pm, I have this clear subroutine that exists in this file on line 9. So now, while doing diagnostics, you can also inspect your symbol table and get information about all of the subroutines, classes, modules that have been loaded during that compilation process. And of course, someone always says, you know, if you're running Perl-C, that is a little bit unsafe. There are, as I just showed, Perl allows arbitrary code execution during compile time, either in begin blocks or check blocks. VS Code tries to handle that, where if you open a file in VS Code that is an untrusted file, you know, download something from GitHub, open it up, it's not going to run any of your extensions on it. It puts it in restricted mode, so you won't get your syntax checking, but it also isn't going to run any begin blocks. Here's an example of a harmful begin block that could be run. And then you have to trust the workspace to get that working. So putting it all together, what the Perl Navigator essentially is a symbol table explorer. Runs Perl-C and lets you explore the symbol table in a visual way. So here's an example, the point module, it knows exactly where the point module is defined. It knows where point new is defined. It's a moose object new. In this case, there's some additional parsing to know that this object is a point object and that the subroutine on this object is that point clear. So then it'll provide you these interactive things. You have what people want in an editor is to be able to click on a function and go directly to the definition. And with the Perl Navigator, the goal was to be able to click on anything, whether it's variables, functions, modules, and have it take you to the definition or give you more information about it. There's a lot of details involved in that. You know, for example, namespace clean is often recommended because when you import modules, in this example, importing list utils sum, that's going to pollute the namespace. So, and you can call methods that have been imported on your objects, but those are things you typically wouldn't want to do. So there's a lot of work to clean up the namespaces prior to exposing them. And there's a lot of details around class inspector, subutil, just to make sure that when you're exploring the symbol table and you're going through this whole pile of stuff that you find there, that it sort of shows the relevant suggestions for autocomplete. Sometimes it can't really determine which function you want. Or here's an example, I have some unknown object, and I'm gonna call the new function on that unknown object. But if I have multiple, if I don't know which object it is, and I have multiple subroutines called new, VS Code has a nice interface that it'll show all the subroutines named new and allow you to sort through them. And that's the navigators serving up all these definitions from the dependencies and using the VS Code interface to page through those options. There's, of course, a lot of details there that I'm skipping over. One big one is when you run Perl-C, it's really parsing all of your dependencies, but it's not fully executing the script you're looking at. So the current file, if you have one file open, you may have 100 dependencies. Perl parses all those dependencies when you run Perl-C, but you get less detail about the actual file you're looking at. So there is a tagger process that'll go and sort of clean up the remaining missing links, and it'll try to use some regular expressions to fill in the gaps of what it's missing. But when you put it all together, you end up with a pretty good understanding of what's happening in your code base. Some additional symbol details around moose support, object pad, it supports moo, dio, set echo, class accessor. So whatever object-oriented framework you like to use, it probably supports it. And because it's using the Perl parser to parse most of your files, it really supports anything that the Perl compiler supports. Another example is just autocomplete on modules, right? I'm going to try to use a module, and I want a listing of all the modules that I have as an option. So if you've started to type use or require, you really want a different set of options. And that's the core aspect of it. But then once it's now that we have a language server, we can start to add on other features. Perl Critic is a good example. And this is an example of a print hello world that has some critic suggestions, essentially use strict, use warnings. Perl Tidy, which if you sort of just right click on your code, you can format the document, or if you highlight a subsection, you can format selection and it'll run that section of code through Perl Tidy. And then there's the Raku Navigator. So done all this work for the Perl Navigator. There's a goal of trying to extend it to the Raku side. So there's a problem with VS Code where it doesn't recognize Raku natively. It only has support for Perl 6. So I was able to take some of the extensions from Atom and reuse the TypeScript language server. So essentially took the same design of the Perl side, and I swapped out the Perl parser for a Raku parser. And you put it all together, you get the same features from the Perl side, or some of the same features, and on the Raku side as well. And of course, I skipped over a lot of details, and this uses a lot of libraries, a lot of dependencies, built on a lot of different technologies, had a number of different contributors on GitHub and in the hackathon. So thanks for everyone who contributed. Any questions? It works in Emacs. There's, yep, yeah, and the go-to definition, error checking, things like that. Yep. Yeah, we got the improved go-to definition. That's some good feedback from Dave. Any other questions? So by default, it tries to use your version of Perl, so it uses the command Perl, but you might have to change the Perl settings. So there is a setting called Perl path that the default is just Perl, which would likely find your system Perl, and you might want to point that to your Perl brood version or preferred version. It works on. I've tested all the way back to Perl 5.8. So it works Perl 5.8 up to 5.36. It doesn't come bundled with Perl. It comes bundled with the Perl dependencies, but it'll use whatever version of Perl you have. Works with Strawberry Perl, Windows, Mac. So I've tested on those version of Perls, but you have to bring your own Perl, but it works with all of those. Sure. Yeah, the end-to-end tests are pretty tricky. The Microsoft language server examples come with an end-to-end test framework in TypeScript that exercise the sort of full end-to-end aspect of the language servers. I don't have many of those tests written. I'd like to add more. Mostly it's been loading the Navigator in different frameworks, right? Loading it on a Linux VM, on a Windows machine, on a Mac machine, for testing I did a lot of the development in Perl 5.8 just to make sure that it worked all the way back. And then once it was done and functioning in 5.8, then load up a new version and sort of assume that it works on most of the versions in between. I'd like to develop a more comprehensive test framework, especially as it, for targeting different architectures. That's still a work in progress. Yep. So the question was for remote SSH development. I did a lot of the development in Windows Subsystem for Linux, and I use at work a remote Linux VM. So it certainly works with that, and I think it works pretty well because when you install VS Code extensions, they install into the remote environment. Question was around testing or providing a safe environment. I know there's been a lot of effort in Perl and a lot of research to try to sandbox. I would like to find out how to do more of that. I think the restricted mode is the short answer, but sure, yeah, if you run it in a remote environment or in a Docker container, and then you might still hose your environment if someone does something destructive in a begin block. But hosing your environment isn't so bad if you have a reproducible container. And certainly if anyone has any ideas for how to restrict the set of opcodes that run in begin blocks or something like that, I'd love to hear them. I think we're out of time, but happy to connect with anyone offline if they have ideas or opportunities for improvement.